Sometimes, things just matter. Like when help needs to get there quickly. When problems need urgent solutions. When small things are a big deal. When your big dream is just one step from reality, or new ways to grow are on the other side of the world, we know that behind every transaction is a purpose that matters. And it's why, together, we are making global finance move fast. With certainty. Wherever, whenever, and however it needs to go. For families, for economies, for all of us. For better.
Hello, and welcome to everyone to this LinkedIn Live session. My name is Simon Daniel. I'm a Securities Product Manager at Swift, and I'm delighted to be joined by Virginie O'Shea from Firebrand Research. Hello, Virginie. Could you give a quick intro, please, for the benefit of our attendees?
Sure, thanks. In terms of what I do, I've spent sort of the last 20 odd years looking at post-trade technology research and advisory work. Spending my time in the last 3 years has been at helming up Firebrand Research, which is a capital markets focused fintech and operations advisory firm. So definitely T+1's in my remit.
Perfect. And delighted to have an expert with us today for that. So just before we get started, so we've got a few housekeeping aspects. You can obviously ask your questions via the LinkedIn Live platform, and we'll look to answer as many of those as we can at the end. Now, as we know, the topic is around the capital industry and the post-trade space in particular. Just before we dive into some of the questions, we want to just set the scene in terms of some of those problem statements that we've been hearing about the industry. So we're going to have a look at a couple of visuals to represent those, just to get us going and get us thinking about some of those issues. Yeah. So obviously, picture worth 1,000 words. Certainly, it will help supplement our conversations. But yeah, as well as some of the benefits which have been introduced, there are obviously a lot of operational impacts and pain points. So I think for today's session, we're going to focus on several of those. In particularly the different segments, the sell side, buy side, custodians, depositories, etc., and the various teams, whether it's settlement, support, technology as well, etc. Oh yeah, the different sizes. Brilliant. Okay, so I think just to get going, so the topic is T+1 and the urgent quest for settlement efficiency. T is not a cup of tea, so that is not our morning drinks. We're talking about trade, well, when a trade settles, so the intended settlement cycle. T+1 means 1 day after execution is when a trade is intended to settle. So that's the headline. Virginie, could you just give us a quick intro in terms of shortened settlement cycles, maybe a bit of the history? A couple of other jurisdictions have gone through it, and obviously US and Canada, etc. So if you could just set the scene for us initially, that'd be great.
Sure. I mean, in terms of T+1, some bond markets are already on T+1. Some equities, actually, to be fair, can already be settled at T+0 on trade date. But when we're looking at moving the whole of the North American market, that's a significant undertaking. And in terms of history, if you cast your minds back to 2014, Europe was the first major region to move to T+2. Yep. And the North American markets followed about 3 years later in 2017. And no doubt we'll see a similar dynamic play out this time, but with the US and Canada taking the lead this time in the driving seat. And in terms of APAC, we've got China obviously in a very shortened settlement cycle. They're on T+0 domestically, and have Stock Connect to help them connect to the rest of the markets via Hong Kong. So to take into account the fact there's a mismatch with the rest of the globe in terms of T+2. Now, the majority of all of the markets are on T+2. India made the move. They began last year in a slightly different manner to the way that North America is planning to move. They're going more of a big bang approach.
Yeah.
So India moved starting in February, I believe it was, and they started with the lowest capitalized stocks and groups of about 100 or 500. and the final grouping of the stocks moved in February this year. So they sort of had a very different approach. It was slightly more operationally complex because they had different stock markets that had to coordinate with each other. So
Yep.
And the way that you sort of picked which stocks were higher capitalized was not the easiest thing to do. So it was an interesting approach. So certainly. I'm not sure that North America would consider that approach. I don't think they ever did. I don't know whether Europe might, though. It'll be interesting to see if we go through a process here and look at it in the future. But we have a date now, as you saw from my meme. 28th of May 2024 is when the SEC has announced the US and Canada are moving. Now, that was a slightly controversial date. Not only is the date not a bank holiday in Canada, which is going to cause the neighbours of the US a little bit more of a headache than they wanted, but the timeline's also challenging for everyone around the world, and it's quite soon. So
just under a year, yes.
Exactly.
Well, just over a year, rather.
Just over a year, yeah, a year and a bit, which is really quick when you think about all the work that needs to go into it, which we'll get onto in a second, I believe. And not to mention the current economic environment. I'm going to put that in there because that's another problem. We've seen downsizing and operations teams are bare bones at the moment. So you have to divide your time between business as usual support and mandatory changes such as this. So it's going to be tough.
Yeah, certainly. I would say, I guess, at least with that date, we have seen a move away from January the 1st, which is never a great date to impose a new change. So that's one positives. And with the India point, we did what we saw across the SWIFT network. We did see the overall settlement efficiencies stayed the same. And then it was a bit of a bump with those last couple of weeks as they put on the majority of those. It went over 10% at one point, but has now flattened down. So to your point, I guess pros and cons on different approaches, whether it's a big bang, a phase, maybe an early period and then a big bit. But yes, as of now, I think the US is very much a big bang approach. And just to touch on it, so other markets, so there's obviously discussions around T1 in Europe and UK as well. Could you add just a bit of context there?
Sure. And so, earlier I think it was at the end of last year, so December, the UK government announced that it would start considering whether we move the domestic market here to T+1. They've set up an accelerated settlement task force who are actually out there working, gathering input from market stakeholders, and they're going to produce a report at the end of this year. It was actually going to be a 2-year period, but it's shortened down to 1 because obviously accelerated settlement and accelerated timeframes for reports. But we're going to hear at the end of this year whether the UK is going to move same as the US and Canada. It won't be the same time frame, obviously, but we'll see when we might move. And AFME has also announced, I think this week, in fact, that it's exploring how to address moving to a shortened settlement cycle across Europe, because obviously that is a relatively difficult thing to do across such a varied set of markets. Yeah, exactly.
Etc. Certainly.
Exactly.
So various impacts for everyone. There's a long list that I know we've talked about. Could you pick a 3 or 4 of the big ones which probably concern everybody, and then we can drill into some of those in a bit more detail? What do people need to be thinking about on the really big things?
Sure. I mean, I think to begin with, when you start talking to people, they generally bring up 3 things. They bring up securities lending and securities financing, for obvious reasons, FX and liquidity, and the crunch in the middle office. So the allocation confirmations, affirmations bit of the process, which can often be very manual, and communication between counterparties there can be challenging. So those tend to be at the top, but I should also stress it's not just a technology change, right? It's a market practices change. I think often we think it's technology is going to fix a problem, but there are a lot of different moving parts to this, and market practices do need to be adapted. There's a long list of those, and regulation also needs to change. So the SEC also has everything from Reg 15C through to Reg Show and all in between have to be reviewed, and they're pretty busy with other things at the moment because they've also proposed many other things, not least of which is like digital assets too. So
yeah, lots in that landscape. I guess so. If we focus on a couple of those pieces, in particularly, you mentioned that post-trade allocation confirmation process. So in that area, obviously it works fairly well today, but with that shortening, I think there's a famous AFME stat. We're going to see 83% less time to deal with those problems in that post-trade space. What can you just give a quick overview in terms of what it means, particularly, I guess, with the cross-border aspect for the move for T1 in US and generally? How much time does that limit us to?
I mean, in terms of the move to same-day affirmation, that's basically what we're going to have to do from
Yep.
2 days to same day. It's going to be more painful for people with manual processes or semi-manual processes moving to full automation, because that's what it requires. And you have to remember that automation on one side isn't enough. It's going to be it's a network effect. So we've got different types of counterparties, different client types out there. Everyone's going to have to invest in automating that process. So you can't be sending, your clients and counterparties can't be sending you spreadsheets on one side to be able to reconcile all this information, because you'll be still bogged down in manual processes there. And now some people have looked at bots, maybe trying to use RPA and things to fix that, but it does those need to be fixed continually as well. So that's sort of a patch over a bandage over a bigger problem that you need to sort of address eventually. We'll also have to do some repapering for client agreements related to confirmation and affirmation as well. So
SLAs, etc.
all of
exactly.
those things, and that needs to be done before the implementation deadline. So it's going to keep your legal teams busy as well. And especially looking at international cutoff deadlines and timelines as well, that have to be reworked to account for the reduction of 24 hours. And firms will also have to review their matching tolerances for allocations confirmations on a field-by-field process, because that's, everything's going to get impacted by this. So you need to make sure that you can catch as many problems as possible ahead of time.
Yeah, I think there's a quote where we're only as fast as our slowest chain, our piece of the chain. And so wherever there are those friction points and blockages today, I think that's only going to be exacerbated with a move to T1, and particularly with a nexus of links. You mentioned a chain of settlement as well. Perhaps you're waiting for a delivery in order to get a receipt out, etc. So just in terms of my understanding of the US allocation confirmation process, so you mentioned same-day affirmation, so that's now going to be 9 p.m. I think on the US is the limit there. There is some ability for a depository member to then still submit a delivery order the next day, but that will not be linked to that whole same-day affirmation. So getting as much done on trade date as possible is probably the essence of what will need to happen. I think there's still about 10% which aren't affirmed on that trade. So it's a reasonable proportion which we're going to have to improve or be handled differently. What about the cross-border? So if you're in the same markets, just there's a famous slide with the different time zones between APAC, Europe, and US. Just a quick comment in terms of if you do a trade end of day, what does that mean to these different regions in order to handle T1?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges, given we're a global market, is sort of liquidity management and FX and things like that as well, that we've got to mention. And that's, that often comes up when I'm talking to people, because FX currently settles on T+2. And transaction funding that's dependent on an FX settlement may fail to settle if it's not moving in time, right? Or if the market's closed, for example. So we've got issues with regards to that. I mean, we're not 24/7, unfortunately. We're not. I know people compare this to it should be 24/7 like crypto, but we're not set up that way, sadly. And you have to think about pre-funding and carefully considering how you sort of address that and the ability to raise collateral. For North American-based trade settlement could be challenging for foreign investors, which could impact returns as well. So, I mean, this could be money, essentially, more money to settle in a North American market. So, US and Canada. So that might mean foreign investment, which is currently about 40% of trade flow in the US, might reduce. So, I mean, obviously the SEC hadn't really thought about that, I don't think, when they talked about the May deadline. Because international preparedness is much lower, I would say, and awareness across different regions varies as well. So we've really got to think about this in terms of, long-term economic impact on the US and Canada. Liquidity and collateral management is also another area that you need to think about too. So there's a lot of pressure on global custodians to coordinate across their global operations too, to support some of those flows. And the further you are away from North America, the worse it gets in terms of liquidity, right?
Yeah, to your point, I mean, that international awareness, greater impacts as well. So and less preparedness. I think a large part that has surprised me is the unawareness. So with just over a year to go, there are still plenty of firms who aren't even aware they have something to do. So I think a big part of it is just using these forums, our communities, in order just to raise awareness to get that kind of topic at least onto their agendas. Now, you mentioned FX liquidity management, cash management, obviously a key, very hugely cited as the biggest indirect impact. You touched on it earlier, the securities finance and collateral. Just could you spend a couple of minutes on that, please, perhaps?
Sure, sure. I mean, just to touch on the previous point that you made, though, I mean, I'd say awareness is raised significantly in the US market and Canada, and people have actually started accommodating time zone challenges for their clients already. So I've seen some smaller firms, sort of mid-sized firms, considering moving their operations or moving their operations to the West Coast to sort of help their Asian-based clients, so that they've got that extra window to be able to deal with them. So that's not a low-cost option by any stretch of the imagination, but it's interesting to see for people that don't have a follow the sun model how they're addressing it. And obviously the smaller mid-tier firms that are international in focus are struggling the most, because they may lose business quickly if they've not got the setup there. And going back to your question just then, I mean, securities lending, that's a revenue stream. Like if you look at what we've seen at the first quarter of this year, we had the securities finance industry generated $2.76 billion in revenue, which was like 27% higher than the same period the previous year. So, and this is not a small number of that's not a small dollar amount. So certainly we've got to think about this long term in this direction of travel we're moving in. What are we going to do to the capital markets if we take or reduce that source of income, right? So this is an interesting thing to bear in mind. I know that the SEC perspective, there's a lot of rules that need to change around securities financing as well, including reducing the number of days that a broker-dealer will have to obtain possession of customer securities. So in terms of closing out customer transactions. So this is where the impact is on revenue. It's because you take some of those days out for lending purposes.
And yet it's a huge part of the engine, isn't it? So, it feeds the liquidity, the ability to be able to settle and move those and borrow and lend in order to have that stock flowing. So, yeah, it's a big part of the engine. So as well as the revenue, it's obviously a key part of the overall post-trade process.
Exactly, yeah. There's many nuances to it as well. So I expect it's going to be something that, and a lot of the technology in that space is, let's say, not the most modern.
No, so, but it does, I guess on the flip side, it supports T0 and T1 today, in that you often post and deliver on a much shorter period. But yeah, it's those knock-on effects, isn't it? Particularly, as you mentioned, that US volume and Canada volume is so substantial, but it's just, it's gonna compress a lot. Just what I think we mentioned it briefly, but if we haven't, the asset servicing piece. So just going through our list of other items to be aware of, corporate actions around. So just a minute or so on how that may be impacted.
Sure. I mean, it's one of the most complex, manual and underfunded areas, asset servicing, right? No secret to anyone. And any small change can have a huge impact on workloads. This is why, I mean, the industry has been so resistant to changing to different standards. ISO 20022 being one of the right. It's tough. I'd say the shortening of the cycle will cause problems. I mean, we're going to bring the ex-dividend date, the ex-date, to the same date as the record dates, which is going to be painful. And global custodians have a business priority to understand where holdings are within the market. So they're going to have to be, the hardest hit by a lot of these changes, because they're the ones at the back end doing a lot of this work. So that's going to be tough for them. And then they'll need to assess their shareholder review process beyond just settled trades, focus on how to better deal with late instructions, as well as automating a lot of the process that's manual at the moment. So there's a lot of people that are reliant, you're reliant on manual processes and people interpreting things and inputting data and things like that, which is, and obviously cleansing, reconciliation, all of these things are going to be tough within a shortened time frame.
Yeah, it's curious. So settlement is often initial owner and investor down to the depository, whereas corporate actions is often issuer back up So it's like it's a different
Exactly.
cycle, and so yeah, and they're often most impacted. So right, we've covered quite a few things. I guess asset classes is the only other one in terms of a big list, just to reference it briefly. In particular, ETFs, and if you do have a basket. Carrying instruments which have different settlement cycles, how to handle that, etc., NAV publishing and all of that. So a lot of impacts there. Just to move it more into the sort of other section of the today's topic, so efficiency. How important is efficiency in this new paradigm? So there's a certain number of fails can be accepted in terms of it's a demonstrating that the market's got a lot of liquidity and movement. But how do you feel, based on what we saw in India, we did see a big spike in terms of settlement fails as they migrated in the last couple of weeks. What do you think may happen with efficiency in T1? And what are your thoughts, opinions? What are you hearing?
I mean, in terms of efficiency, I'd say a good indicator of how ready the industry, looking at North America, is for changes is how many firms have sort of updated technology in their middle and back office. And around some of our research, Firebrand research, estimates that the majority of banks and brokers out there, around about 81% of them, have significantly outdated systems that need updating. So that is a huge amount of work to go on within 12 months. And globally, we've got an even greater challenge. So obviously, as you mentioned, fails will go up for an undefined period of time after a big market practice change. But technology is certainly one piece of this bigger puzzle that needs to be thought about. So I think that's something that, budgets are tight at the moment, as I mentioned. So who is going to end up paying for these structural changes is an issue. If efficiency is not free, efficiency improvement, it requires a lot of investment, a lot of focus for everybody in the cycle. And the sell side may be wary of passing costs to their buy side clients. They always have been. So where does that investment come from? It's got to come from somewhere. That hence my everyone pointing at each other in that meme. But if every market participant needs to make operational and technology changes across their systems, then some unlucky demographic out there is going to face the brunt of the costs, both direct and indirect. So I don't know who that will be, but generally it will be passed through to the end investor at some point. Right?
Yep. And I think it was a Bernie Mellon report. A lot of recent technology investments have been all moving to cloud, for example. And you mentioned RPA as well earlier. So it tends to be a lot of those unilateral technology changes, which aren't necessarily community technology changes. So yeah, definitely technology will play a part. But I think with a year to go, we're not going to have a major technology change embedded in time to support that T1 quickly. It's going to be a bit more tactical, perhaps, in certain spaces. But yeah, so where are the current problems? Just to say what we see in terms of the settlement process, around about 15% of all of instructions or settlements are non-STP. They require a cancel rebook or a change, etc. So there's quite a bit of churn in that pre-settlement space, and then I think globally it's about 4 or 5% of all trades fail. So where in that, given we're compressing that cycle, do we think we're going to see those? Which of those pain points would probably make sense to focus on in terms of being prepared for T1?
I think it's just getting rid of the fails that are caused by data problems or issues that you can't actually resolve. I don't think you can ever eliminate fails completely, unfortunately, just by the nature of the market and the different regional and time zone issues and anything to do with that. So different types of clients, all of that kind of thing. So that sort of mosaic's always going to be there. But if firms are going to make the investments to improve, they need to bring their clients, service providers and counterparties with them. It's a journey. So that's why collaborative services like what you're doing with the unique transaction identifier at Swift is going to be helpful, because you need to have platforms that people can use to understand where the underlying problems are. And the more transparency around this stuff, the better, because you want to get to resolving the problems that can be resolved quickly.
That's a great. So you make a good point. So in terms of, we're always going to have certain fails. So if you are short, then it's an individual problem. And we heard from several brokers, and if my inventory is, I can always borrow or or move from a different account, etc. But those static issues, SSIs often get quoted, so discrepancies between the two parties. In this day and age, those are fairly simple problems that we should be able to solve through automation and data. And to your point, I do think that common reference will help pick up those issues sooner, but also enable a process for all parties to have awareness and fix them quicker. And so that transparency that will hopefully clean up what are fairly simple static issues. Okay, moving on. How do we think T+1 is going to magnify some of those issues? Or actually, no. Let's go on to, do we think T1 could eventually lead to higher efficiency levels?
Well, that's the hope. I think that's
Yes.
I mean, that's here. I mean, I think certain things that we just need to do for the modernization of the industry. This brings up things like dematerialization of securities. Right, there are some markets that still have paper flying around. The UK being one of them. Right, that's inefficient. We need to resolve that. And if we are moving to a faster settlement cycle and more efficiency, we do need to just address all of these underlying problems that need to be looked at. And likewise with regards to sort of the modernization of the middle and back office. I mean, a lot of those systems have been sitting there lurking in the background for a long period of time.
Green screens, yes.
Well, I mean, the thing is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's always been the attitude. But to some extent, you just can't run batch processes in a shortened time frame. You can't scale to that. So these things just have to be retired at some point, if we are to be, moving into the modern world, not reliance on 1980s or 1970s technology rather. So, but I think a lot of the success factors will be reliant on testing as well, because any market structure change, there's always a testing period, which is why I worry about this time frame of 12 months. I'm not sure that's enough time to change processes and then do all the testing you need to do with all those different systems, let alone working with the market infrastructures like DTCC to test the systems back and forth there as well. Yeah. So it's going to be.
And resilience is so number one for everybody that I couldn't agree more. That's a very key area for us to be aware of for any changes.
Absolutely.
Testing. So just quick word, it wouldn't be a topic on settlement efficiency if we didn't mention CSDR very briefly, regulations, but also the future. So CSDR refit, I believe, has some potential look at perhaps shortened settlement cycles. But what are you hearing in terms of? I know mandatory buy-ins is still on the future agenda, but just a quick comment on what you're hearing in terms of the CSDR refit process.
Yeah, I mean, if we look sort of at the level of settlement penalties are much higher than anyone anticipated. For example, we've got Firebrand stats that say that large firms are paying round about between €1 million and 2.8 million euros a month, which is high, and that's something that needs to come down. And we have to think about, from the ESMA perspective, they're not happy with the current level of fails. Let's be frank. They expected it to come down much quicker. And they're around about, I think, 7% from the last figures for equities at the moment. So that's all 7.5, which is much higher in terms of fails at that level. And bonds have gone up as well. They haven't gone down. So in terms of fails, so that's worrying. And we've seen similar Bank of England figures at the end of last year in terms of fails. So there's certainly a lot of worries there, and how ESMA addresses this is up for debate, but they've talked about things like increasing fines and CSD exclusions, and then again, the dreaded mandatory buy-ins coming in. I know that they promised initially not to bring that in before 2025, but who knows at this point? It could come back in again.
Yep, we need to, more preparation, I guess. And it's, in a way, whilst we're looking at T1 in the US, whatever changes are made, I guess, particularly for the large firms, should be considered globally, because any improvements in these processing will benefit you across whichever jurisdiction you're in. So that's something to consider. So what about the future? So obviously regulation. Are there any opportunities here? So we've mentioned technology, but could there be some potential new business models with T1? I think officially, the CSDR regulation is up to T2, so we may see some markets adopting a T1 in certain instruments or something. There must be some hope that this is an opportunity for some new business models as well. Is that naive? Is there perhaps something there?
I'm a skeptic, so I'm always worrying about things. But certainly, it could be an opportunity for different markets to pick up trading flow. When changes happen and costs and complexities increase in certain markets, other markets have a door open for them. So in the interim, it might actually be beneficial to Europe if North America moves and some of the flow from Asia actually comes to Europe, which I'm sure would be good for us. But certainly, the direction of travel in future is towards T+0, and Gary Gensler mentioned it a lot during the announcement. So an instant settlement seems to represent an opportunity there for technology providers. Certainly the blockchain crowd have been talking about it loudly over the last few months. But I'm going to quote Jeff Goldblum at you from Jurassic Park. So my biggest concern is that rushing into instant settlement, we're trading one risk for another. So regulators like the SEC could become so preoccupied with whether we can move to instant settlement and not stop to think whether we actually should move to instant settlement. So
yes.
That's my cheesy quote of the day.
No, that's good. And yes, there are some dinosaurs among us, so it's always good to bring a Jurassic element in. Okay, I think we're up in terms of the general topic. So we do have several questions from the audience, so I may just refer to some of those. So, well, a more general one to get us started from Sarah. What is the main barrier in the USA to moving to T+1? So the biggest barrier, operations, post-trade, technology. Yeah.
I would say there's so many moving parts to it. It's hard to put your hands around just one, I think, because it impacts so many different business areas. And then that's part of the coordination problem as well for each individual organization, because you're not just talking sort of settlements, you're talking communications with clients, you're talking securities lending, you're talking asset servicing. So I think the biggest issue is the fact it's a huge project, and trying to coordinate internally and externally is going to be hard, because, as I say, it's not just one institution's problem, it's everyone's problem.
Yep, definitely. So actually leading on to that, everyone's problem. So there was another question about which firms within the settlement process have the most work to do. So you've got your traditional buy side, sell side at the top. You've got more the custody network and the agents, etc., and then the depositories at the bottom, and CCPs as well as a key party in that, FICC and SEC, etc. Do you think any of them have got more? I think all of them have got work to do.
Right.
Yeah, I'd say perhaps the buy side, I have heard some buy sides think it's not their problem. Maybe it's more a hedge fund prime broker relationship, and they say it's the primes to deal with that. But it's something I have heard that maybe they think it's not my problem. I dismiss that. I'd say they certainly need to do something.
They will do, invariably. I think it touches everybody. But I mean, if you have outsourced your middle and back office extensively, then it is your provider's problem to some extent in many areas, though you will have other things like funding, pre-funding and things like that they won't deal with, you'll have to deal with yourself. So certainly there are certain aspects that the buy side's right. It's not quite as big for them, but the larger the firm, the more problems they have. The bigger the bigger the custodian, for example, the more systems they have to change and the more processes they'll have to change. And the more markets they're in, the more they'll have to adapt, and particularly with the Asian pre-funding and things like that. So certainly I think, and market infrastructures have a huge amount of work to do. So I know that DTCC's done a lot already, but they've certainly got a lot more to do in the coming months, particularly, as I say, with the testing side of things with the market.
Yep, it's a good relationship in the US between the regulator and those providers. I think ESMA is obviously a little bit more fragmented with a number of market infrastructures, so it does make it particularly more complex in Europe. So we're part of that AFME working group, and we'll see what ESA as well have got their good T+1 working group. And we'll see what the UK Trade Force comes out with, and I think SIFMA have got their own paper. So my goodness, it's a very big topic. It is. There are some positives, I believe, to the move, but there's going to be a lot, particularly in our world of post-trade, there's going to be a lot of operational impacts. So I'm just going to almost close there, but is there any final points? So we've gone from the positives to the negatives. There are some potential for benefits, maybe perhaps unintended, an undocumented feature, as they often say. Any closing comments you'd like to make, Virginie, in terms of T1 and where we're going?
Sure. I mean, I think the trajectory is positive. I don't get me wrong. And I do think it will make people in the middle and back office's lives easier if we do invest in the right technology and processes to make the whole process much more automated. So in the long term, it's a good thing. It's going to be painful.
As is the way, especially in product, we know where we want to get to. It's the steps to get there. So hopefully these sessions can help lay out some of the steps to avoid and some of the steps that we all should be taking. So thank you very much, Virginie, for your time today, and for everyone for participating. My name has been Simon Daniel from Swift, and I'd like to say thank you for all your attendance and good luck with the future. And if you look for any more information, we're happy to help. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.